This is Emilie Conrad, founder of Continuum,
Hi.
who I have worked with for the last 18 years. She's been an amazing advocate for me. And we first met about a year after my accident, when I saw her during her lunch break at Omega Institute, because I couldn't be in her workshop. And I could barely walk. I walked haltingly, you might say, across the lawn into her cabin, where I laid on the floor and started doing micro movements, which are small incremental movements, because that's all I could do.
Right. So when I saw Jennifer, when she says haltingly, she was extremely in a state of suspension, and her movement was, and her eyes were fixed, and it was, she looked to me like she was in a great deal of shock. And when we started to work together, the easiest point of entry was doing micro movements, because they're not very demanding. They're just these very small movements. And I like to begin them in the knee. I have several reasons for that. One of them is to bring the person, when a person's in shock, they're out of their bodies, they're like this. And also, you had been in a coma for 2 months, and so the coma was still there also. And so it's like you're bringing a person down into the earth plane. So and it's easy to move the knee. And so the very small movement of the knee, you have to pay attention to that.
Yeah.
When you're doing a micro movement. So your consciousness is coming down into the leg, and so it's starting to pull your energy down. And so it's kind of like doing this. But from my perspective, it's very hard to tell in an injury how much shock is being sustained. Now, I don't know if why don't you tell the people watching this what your diagnosis was?
Well, my accident was November 17th, 1992. And I had what in medical terminology is called a diffuse closed head injury. And I was in a coma 2 months. And a diffuse closed head injury means your brain is really injured all over. So, and it was very deep. It was incredibly deep. And they didn't think I would talk or walk again. But I walked across the lawn to Emilie's cabin.
The issue of, and I've explained this at various times, that shock is, we have to really get that shock is the body trying to protect itself. So what it does, the person goes out of their bodies, it's like this, and the throat locks, and everything pulls up. And what goes on is that there's an enormous amount of stress hormones that get released to stop any pain. Mm-hmm. And going into shock means that you've dissociated, so that you're not there. And then a further degree of shock is coma. In other words, where you're further up into leaving the earth plane. And so it's so interesting in relation to the diagnosis and and how someone recovers. I mean, so we have to even say that your spirit was just not ready to cash it in at that time. It just wasn't. And, as one of the things that I've always felt is that your championship nature of being a horsewoman and entering into competition, etc., that you were used to going for the gold. You were used to taking the journey of being challenged. You know, you competed, you trained, you were with a horse, you know, you did all these things, and it was such a big part of your life, but that's your nature.
Right.
And so it feels to me that your recovery, I'd like to take a lot of credit for it, but I have to say that you have the nature that is a kind of indomitable spirit. And the fact that you're even doing this website now and reaching out into the rest of the world, I think is very, very important. I think the level of brain injuries that we're seeing with the vets,
Right.
I personally feel that your video, A Distant Memory, should be seen in every brain injury situation, whether it's in the VA or any other place, because of the level of your injury and also of your capacity to reintegrate and to go through the journey of what it means to bring yourself back again.
Right.
And I just think it's been incredible. And so I just could not be more supportive of you being an example of a kind of spirit of not saying no, and of being able to willingly move into processes that have really helped you so much. So I think that, there have been other people involved, like the eye person that you went to.
Dr. Patcha.
Jennifer's eyes wouldn't track, which had a lot to do with the brain injury. And there were, let's see, what else were you, the other people involved?
Well, Dr. Patcha was the ophthalmologist, neuro-ophthalmologist.
Eyes weren't tracking.
I did neurofeedback with Margaret Ayers,
Yeah.
who unfortunately died, but Janet Bloom. I did tons of cranial sacral and osteopathy, and was Stefan Gopian here in LA. I've done acupuncture. A lot of, in the beginning I had to do a lot of regular medicine, but then working with you has moved me into alternative because how much it's helped me, continuum. I wasn't, and so for me, continuum, as I've been doing it for the past 18 years, nonstop, almost every day, has really been my grounding point. It's like preparation for my show before I get on stage to do my one-woman show. I do continuum. I have to do, it grounds me, it keeps me together. And my mom always says to me if I'm like kind of not seeming together, or she's like, Jennifer, I think you need to go do some continuum. Because it's like how I become me.
Well, it's interesting because in continuum, let's just say continuum is more interior than most movement. In other words, it's not exercise. It's not aerobic exercise. It's more of an inner journey, and the one of the things that I feel is really important in relation to the movement way that we work in continuum, all of continuum is there to honor the fluid that moves through. We're 80% fluid, and my theory is that the fluid in the body, the fluid in the planet, and the fluid in the galaxy represent one resonant stream of what I call biocosmic intelligence. And this is the whole inquiry of continuum, and that the choreography of the fluid presence is primary medicine. So when we see, in other words, water undulates, water moves in spirals, water pulses. And so that the whole spirit of fluid resonance is to unify, to
Right.
bring together. So in the movement work that we were doing, it wasn't so much to get reflex activity and forward thrust and this and that. It wasn't that kind of movement. It was to engage in the spiral of life itself. And so that as a body is moving in these ways, the organism is becoming increasingly more coherent.
Right.
And so that as it is doing that, there is a blossoming into life. So, but you also are a fabulous candidate for this. In other words, because of your championship tendencies, you know, of you being able to have that nature, and also because you've trained. And so when I say to you, you know, you need to practice this for at least an hour or two every day,
Right.
you say to me, oh, is that all? because the pattern of shock and the pattern of the coma, which we found very often when you would be moving, the tendency of your head to go back into exactly where your head was during the coma. And the whole pull, like almost a magnet to go back into that. So that imprint is so strong because the body, the integrity of the body is to protect itself. So shock is a form of protection, and coma actually, although it has all kinds of connotations, but actually the system is also protecting itself. So, in fact, the medical community put people in comas. It's called medical coma to rest the system, make it kind of hibernate, you know, to allow a certain kind of rest to take place. So, I think that your personality, in terms of being really a champion, and it can't be excluded from the mix of your recovery. I mean, I think that I think the eye work was just terribly important. You know, one of the things when people say that you, when they say, "Oh my goodness, you so much better," because there's more there in your eyes.
Right.
I mean, your eyes used to really be quite off track, and they're not.
Right.
And your movement surety. In other words, there's less hesitation in your movement. Like sometimes there would be that disruption. It seems to me there's much less of that.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's like, you know, you were saying about the championships. Well, all the little improvements I make are all, like, I really use my movement. And when you say, Jennifer, you've improved so much, or I congratulate you, or that to me is a blue ribbon. And so I've transformed my tangible blue ribbons into blue ribbons I give myself.
Well, good. I'm glad for that. Well, one of the things that you wanted to talk about was the issue of the brain. Wasn't that one of your questions?
It was.
And what is the exact question?
The exact question is, you know, recently you've been doing a lot of new work with the brain and continuum.
Yeah.
And so how would you say that that work corresponds would you say was, how does the continuum work that we do together correlate to my brain?
Okay, so there's a couple things. One of them is in relation to movements that are more complex. And by that I mean, for whoever's watching, if you take a movement that is a movement that we're more familiar with, a movement like this, which is a push-pull kind of movement, shortening and lengthening of the muscle. And although this is a very valuable movement, from a neurological point of view, it has reflex. But there's not a whole lot of information in it in the sense of the scope of neural plenum, because the movement is straightforward and it's repetitive. In other words, it becomes a pattern movement, and so that the neural stimulation of that stays very, very limited. When you have a movement that moves like this, let's say, the movement has no specified direction, and it has a scope of many multi-movements happening within a phrase that is actually neurologically very rich. Mm-hmm. So when we engage in movements like that, the system is moving into a neural abundance. There's another aspect to this and when you say that I've been recently exploring this, has been the recent work with glial cells and astrocytes. The glial cell is it's wrapped around a neuron, and they used to think that it was just packaging and that it was just there to help the neuron. Now they're seeing that that the entire system is composed of 90% glial cells, and that the stem cell of the glial is called an astrocyte, and it moves in a lateral way. So it has a lateral octopus kind of signature of movement. So one of the things we've been exploring in Continuum, in the last phase, I don't know when this started, a couple of years ago, I guess, is, and I like to use this analogy of fractals. Fractal is, it's from geometry. It means similar pattern. So that the parting of a neuron, the branching of a neuron, the branching of a leaf, the branching of a river, the branching of a star can be seen as a similar pattern. That's what it means. Mm-hmm. So in other words, anytime you see something that is a similar pattern, they refer to that as a fractal. Yeah. And what it is, it puts you into relationship with a universal choreography. In other words, when you move like something, you're in relationship to it. And, I wrote a book a while back, I'm going to just say, it's called Life on Land, so there's a plug for my book. But at one time in my career, I worked with actors. And one of the things in acting is if you find the gesture of the character, you will find the character. The gesture is like a hologram. So if you find a gesture like this for your character, that's going to not only inform the audience, but the gesture, the hunched back, the hands, the eyes looking like this, all of that is creating a whole scene that the character is in. Well, it's very interesting, but the same holds true for fractal movements, mm-hmm. that they're like holograms. And the reason I'm saying this is that when we go into these lateral octopus-like movements, it is the same movement as the astrocyte, which is the stem cell of the brain.
Yeah, I read and loved that book by Daniel Koob.
Yeah, Andrew Koob.
Andrew Koob.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and all this...
What was that called again?
It's called A Root of Thought.
Root of Thought.
The Root of Thought. So, Andrew Koob, K-O-O-B, and you can get it on Amazon, not the commercial. This is relatively new research, but But it's very, very important in terms, again, of the amount of brain injuries that are going on now with the vets, and also the issue of Alzheimer's. That there's a they did a study recently of Alzheimer because the degree of dementia, Alzheimer, and neurological deficit is commensurate with the aging process. And so everybody's looking at, so they're looking at exercise, looking at diet, they're looking at crossword puzzles, other kinds of mental stimulation, good relationship, you know, that kind of thing, and people still get Alzheimer's. So what are they leaving out? One thing they're leaving out is sensation. In the movement processes that we do, it was very interesting when you said, I couldn't feel a thing. Because shock actually is designed to stop you from feeling.
Right.
So you don't feel, I mean, it's the body protecting itself, so you don't feel anything. But also you can't recover if you can't feel. So what I find very interesting is that sensation is primary, meaning that the organism, even in utero, the embryo is feeling. So sensation is a key factor in terms of whether we're awake or not. Like when you sense something, it means you're aware, so you become awake. So the issue of having and I'm just saying this as I think an important part of research is the person having a broadband sensing faculty. One of the things that stops sensation is speed and stress. Stress will erase sensation, and so will speed. Sensation's at a much slower level than speed. So it's very interesting. The speedier the culture gets, the less the sensing capacity. And so when I can't feel, then I have to use my higher brain to figure everything out because I can't feel.
Right.
Okay, so we know that if you keep using a muscle in the same way, it's going to deteriorate. So it would stand to reason that the polarization of not being able to sense and having to keep my neocortex on the constant reference would have a lot to do with the deterioration. If the same principle, there is no question, if you use a muscle in the same way, it'll build up for a while, and then if you keep doing it, it's going to deteriorate because it becomes a closed system.
Right.
The issue, when people say exercise, well, it is true, if you play tennis, you get a lot of variety of movement, but it's kind of all along the same line, meaning, you know, it's all kind of external. So that the interior capacity is really not developed.
Right. Well, that's what I love when you said that I really had a lot of love of movement and curiosity. It's because when I go internal into myself, it's like a whole world. I mean, I love to play in the unknown, although I'm kind of scared of the unknown.
But you go anyway.
But I go anyway.
I mean, that's okay to be scared, but go anyway.
Right.
Yeah.
And to find new things, and when I can accomplish new things, it's, as I said earlier, it's a blue ribbon day for me. It's exciting. I feel like jumping up and down. I mean, it's almost like I've discovered something big, and I've just discovered a new movement or a new way to express myself or experience myself. And that, to me, is how I've transformed my competing and winning blue ribbons to my life today of inspirational speaking and moving.
Right, and I yes, and I want to mention, I think it would be important, if it's okay with you, that one of the surprises we had in our work together and was the issue around you being a forceps delivery, which I didn't even know that.
Right.
And so I just want to say to the people who are watching, forceps delivery is when you're being pulled out with forceps, obviously, usually here. And the baby, as far as I'm concerned, goes into primal shock. The baby's like this. And so the baby's being forced out. It's like this. And you know what? It stays like that, meaning that the imprint of shock is actually in the system as a basic imprint. And what was so interesting in our work together was that at some point, that whole reality began to emerge of the forceps.
Right.
In other words, shock. It was not just the shock that was coming out of the coma and the accident, but as we went deeper, it was the shock of the forceps delivery that began to appear. Mm-hmm. And I had no idea that. I mean, for some reason, we never talked about it, so I didn't know that.
Right, but I remember sitting in your apartment with you, and you asked me about it, and I said, well, yeah, I was a forceps delivery, and it was kind of like my accident was a reenactment of that forceps delivery.
It was the coma. It was the issue of being in a tunnel, let's just say, where I'm not moving, and so that was it was very similar to the baby not wanting to come out into the birth canal and being yanked, because the feeling of you, and it was so interesting in relation to my working with you, was I felt like I was kept doing this of getting you out of the tunnel. Mm-hmm. And so there was that feeling of pulling. So in a way, it was almost like midwifing in a certain way of this, and then that whole the whole issue of the forceps came up. Mm-hmm. So that was really yeah.
Yeah, and that was interesting, and how they, past experiences like reenact themselves in my continuum work, like the position of my head when I was in a coma, because I had done, I don't know, I was protecting something, and so as I was in a coma, my head turned over to the left, and as I've practiced continuum now, that reenacts itself.
Mm-hmm. I know, but I mean, in each time there seems to be more. One of the things that I've been struck with, and I think it would be interesting for you to demonstrate that, is you being able to sustain movement for longer and longer periods of time.
Yeah.
So there's a couple things involved. So when we can, I'd like you to do the latissimus, the turning, with the arm that way there. I have a couple of reasons for asking you to do that. One of them is that when we move through the latissimus like that, it will have a tendency to rotate and spiral the body. So there's a couple things, and as you're doing it, I'll comment on certain things that I think are important in relation to your movement.
Good.
Okay.
Okay.
Here we're watching Jennifer. She's demonstrating a movement that we do in continuum. And I want you to know as you watch this that this is actually in real time. So one of the things that's important about this particular sequence is how slowly she's able to move and maintain that. So we have to know that the level of shock and trauma to her body is not dominating her body. There's no way that you can move slowly like this and be maintaining shock. And if you notice, she's moving through connective tissue, which spirals all through the entire body. And the language of connective tissue is that it is a communication from the top of the head to the bottom of the foot. So as you can see, as she's moving into a kind of a spiral, and what I think is important here also is the freedom of her head moving. And as her head tips back, her sphenoid bone, which is inside the head, it's a butterfly bone, is angling itself to gravity. And to me, that is such an important movement of the wholeness of the system. She also, interestingly enough, is reaching out with her arm. And again, when a person is in trauma, it's the opposite. It's a concave movement. It's a movement of withdrawal and of concealment. And here she is spread, and she is completely laterally reaching. And in a sense, her mission in life is to reach out. That she has decided to do public speaking on brain injury and her recovery and the recovery possibilities of other people. See, here you can feel there's a spiral effect of her head as it's turned and the movement of her foot. It's all one thing. And particularly here we have her moving through the whole sole of the foot. So it's a complete movement. We have to know that all her tissue is engaged. And here she's pausing. And what's important here is there's no tremor of any kind. That this is a completely smooth movement. You would never know in 1,000 years that this is a person who's had a severe brain injury. She's resting inside the movement now. And as you can see, the movement is effortless. She's not exerting any force, anything. She is riding the choreography of fluid as it expresses itself in her tissue. So in a sense, she's resting. Just the way a surfer would rest on a wave, she is resting. So again, we're noticing the total calm in her system. We have to know that when we're doing movements like this, the chemical outpouring, from my point of view, even though I don't have direct evidence, but I would say is oxytonic, meaning that there is a feeling of connection and bonding, of deep pleasure. And again, the impact of a trauma, extreme brain injury, which she sustained, and all of the limitations that had occurred, we're seeing a totality of engagement here that is not reflecting the dominant of any kind of traumatic event. So there is no way, again, that she could move as slowly as this. She's being sustained by an inner strength. And if you can feel how her fingers are reaching out, how the whole sense of her gesture is reaching out.